I'm going to talk a bit about digital methods and social movements. So I think pretty much spot on to what the topic of today's conversation is about. And I'm going to do that by telling you a story about a technical and social piece of infrastructure that we accidentally developed in collaboration with partners on the African continent. And the we here is kind of a cast of thousands. I'm listing some of them here, but at this point this is a joint initiative primarily between Georgia Tech in the United States and UNUCS in Macau, but it's included really, as I say, many, many collaborators across the planet. So about 5 years ago, actually towards the end of 2010, I started working with colleagues from Harvard University to engage with a collection of civil society groups in Nigeria. And these groups spanned a wide range of activities, from women's health to judicial and prison reform groups. So they're a collection of civil society and NGO organizations, and none of them worked at this intersection of social movements or digital technologies. However, as we spoke to this collection of civil society actors in Nigeria, we came to realize they had two preoccupations towards the end of 2010 and in early 2011. And that was essentially about digital engagements and political development. And in particular, political action as it related to the very soon to occur April 2011 national elections in Nigeria, the upcoming presidential and parliamentary elections of Nigeria. And this preoccupation spanned everything that these civil society groups were thinking about. They maybe were a women's health organization, but all they could talk about were two things: elections and Facebook. And they really were, in certain degrees, giving up for at least this short period of time, 6 months, 9 months, the core purposes of their work, the important core purposes of their work, as they worried over and obsessed over elections and Facebook. So emerging from this engagement of these U.S. universities and a coalition of Nigerian civil society groups, we formed a new consortium of digital political activists called Enough is Enough Nigeria. Their logo is here on the screen. And EIE Nigeria remains to this day a coalition of youth, digital, civil society actors. Their members kind of self-identify themselves as the Niger generation or the Facebook generation of Nigeria. And given that this was 5 years ago in Nigeria, this really was the birth of such a generation, such a people, such a community in that West African country. It was really the very beginnings of Facebook having some popularity across the country beyond just a very teeny veneer of digital elites. I'm wondering how this particular context resonates today in Hong Kong, which is a couple weeks until the legislative action. If you went to a women's health NGO in the city today, would they want to talk to you about elections for the next couple weeks, or would they be still happily working on women's health or judicial reform? I don't think the audio levels are set. I'll just... I think it's the cable's a little dodgy.
Where is the outreach?
Where is the president?
Where is the movement? Because they've turned it into a fad now. Where is the movement? Where is the outreach? Enough is enough. Let's do something.
So the little technical snafu notwithstanding, this gives you a sense of who the Niger generation is, who these Facebook generations in West Africa are, and how they kind of are politicizing their activity along the lines of their digital engagements and social media practice.
I will register, I will select carefully I will vote wisely. I will protect my votes. I will two-face Dibia. You said, go out there, register, select, vote, protect. To Baba say so.
So this is Two-Face Idibia. Some of you may be knowing he's a quite popular West African hip-hop artist. If this was a more international or West African audience, we'd all now take a pause to make fun of his accent. That's what people like to do if they're not from Nigeria. He has a very particular Nigerian English accent. But this was, again, the kind of community that we were working with. Socially very engaged, terrified, I think is not too strong a word, for the upcoming election and its potential outcome. If it went well, things could potentially progress okay. If it went poorly, it could take out the country and its neighbors. This was a true sense of the seriousness with which this election was being viewed. And so what this happened was we show up with this international set of university partners to work with civil society groups. They're like, we don't care about our normal core mission anymore. All we care about is Facebook and elections right now. At least bring us through April 2011. Get us safely to the other side as partners from the international community with us. Then we'll worry about the other stuff that we do in our day-to-day mission. And what we heard from that as we worked with our collaborators in country is the need for a groundswell of digital methods and social development. And this in and of itself suggested to us a pathway that I would say is not just software development, but development software. By which I mean the creation of a software artifact and system focused on political development objectives that our Nigerian partners held. So if software development is just the creation of those artifacts, then development software is the creation of such artifacts in the context of international development objectives. And the urgent need for this development software, as viewed by our Enough is Enough consortium partners, was to be able to monitor what they conceptualized as social media, to identify relevance, veracity, and novelty of, let's say, tweets and posts over Facebook, tweets over Twitter and posts over to Facebook, and to provide a real-time response. And Professor Wen, right before lunch, had that big image where we saw hundreds of different big data operators. Many of those are organizations providing platforms that provide some sort of analytics and aggregation capacities for vacuuming up and studying, let's say, tweets and posts to Facebook, right? I mean, a lot of those organizations do similar kinds of things, right? Well, we were, thank you. We were in real time tasked with putting together some technologies that would serve this particular need of these civil society, Niger generation Nigerians, which is to allow them in their kind of envisioning of the possibilities to monitor Twitter and Facebook and other online platforms for potentially real-time actionable reports as it relates to the election in April of 2011. Now, as I was listening actually to Melissa this morning, I added these two slides, and it's because I've only shown these two slides publicly once before, and at that point it was at Georgia Tech to demonstrate how us faculty members routinely underestimate the amount of work we're pushing upon our students. And those of you who are students here, nod in agreement that your faculty members have no idea how much work they're actually asking you to do at any time. What this email shows, this was an email to a PhD student of mine at the time, is in March 28th, so 2 weeks prior to the election, suggested that he simply, without requiring any huge amount of coding or coordination among the instances, get an aggregator instance, something that will pull together multiple social media streams, and share and manage them with URLs that you want to get data from, voila. Now, if my advisor sends me an email saying, in 2 weeks, do this thing, voila, right away, I know I'm in trouble. And then I end with, then we could consider similar alert systems from the Twitter feeds and Facebook scrapes, so this would be harder, by which I mean scraping Facebook is harder, and may require some natural language analysis. Well, that's, just another extra night of work. I doubt there is time to implement this for next week, though among our geeks we have expertise in the required domains. It's something about how we value or don't value work. That's why I was thinking about you this morning as you were talking about this, and how we really, as scholars, and in my case, with a background in computer science, have no clue as to what is the actual workload involved in any of the tasks that we undertake. And at best, we have retrospective or historical clues, but even then, because we're not able to actually self-reflect on the work that we've undertaken and tell which of it was, how was it work in scare quotes and how is it work not, et cetera, we even historically often have no clue how much work we're doing. But what is clearly the case in this fumbling email from me to a PhD student is I was asking him to build an enormous software platform for the purpose of our partners in Nigeria in 2 weeks' time. And he went off and started doing it. Now, we did have a set of other partners, and just to be clear, of the U.S. coalition. From the U.S. side, we were working with our very close partners at the Berkman Center, now the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, an organization that I've had over a decade of affiliations with, and with the MIT Media Lab, an organization I've had a decade or so of affiliation. So we had this team in place, and we were all putting together the software and social artifact. So what exactly is this artifact? Again, that we suddenly decided to do with 2 weeks before the election because nothing was working for our purposes towards these ends. And essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to aggregate across media, transmedia inputs in real time into some sort of aggregation platform that then provides a human in the loop the opportunity to, with some supportive analytics, engage in veracity and relevance detection and then escalation for real-time actionable response. And for us, real-time meant, let's say, 60 minutes. Because if you're thinking about an election or a crisis of many sorts, a natural disaster, a health emergency, et cetera, 60 minutes is about at the outlier of what real-time would allow for. Let's say, for instance, that the report is that a polling place is out of ballot papers. If you arrive much more than an hour or so later, the election day is over. You might as well not have shown up at all with your ballot papers because the opportunity for that polling unit to actually allow its citizens to vote have come and passed. So that's the point of the real-timeness here. A lot of social media analytics is done not in that sense of real time. It might be that you could do it over the next week or the next month or the next 6 months. Here we're talking about systems that, because of the nature of the problem that we are collaboratively endeavoring to solve, in this case, real-time escalation and response to electoral issues, real-time, we're saying it's about an hour at the outset because the election is only over the course of maybe 9 hours that day. So this is the basic architecture of the system that we began to work with. Again, working with a very diverse group of both West African and international US-based partners. The Aggie system itself is that aggregator tool. And so we're going to be talking about this particular software artifact called Aggie, which originally stood for aggregation tool. I even forget. And now we just call it Aggie. It has no meaning. It's sort of like AT&T and these other kind of acronyms that, or IBM or whatever, they started as a heavy meaning and now they just are letters. The basic system, I think, is as your intuition or experiences would allow you to suggest. This flowchart, I think, is hopefully natural to you. Reports, which could be tweets over Twitter or posts over Facebook or texts over SMS or reports over Ushahidi or things from the South China Post over a syndicated RSS available website or ... would come in having been first curated by our subject expert collaborators in country. Those captured reports would be aggregated within the data set for the Aggie platform. Queries would then automatically be placed against the incoming real-time stream of social media and other online source materials. Those then could, with human expertise, go through real-time relevance and veracity checking. The analysis or decision to apply an incident to some of those particular reports, an incident being a term we created for this system to mean that we're grouping together relevant actionable reports that we want to call an incident. Let's say polling unit number 75 is out of ballot papers. That would be an example of an incident, and then responded to, again, for real-time action. And these incidents, along with other queries, could be visualized in these real-time trends analysis. And this was all managed through a web-based client-side piece of software that allowed you to curate reports, group them into incidents, and send them for real-time response and follow-up. Now, in 2011, for those of you who follow closely West African politics, the initial elections, which included the governor elections at the state level, proceeded with reasonable safety and security. There was no significant problems within the election, and our program and the Aggie system proceeded without any major issues. But as some of you may know, after the April 16th presidential election in Nigeria, widespread violence erupted, in particular in the north of the country. Thousands died. The country was on the brink. And we quickly retooled elements of the software platform and, in particular, the query collection, such that the system, rather than focusing on electoral irregularities, instead focused upon acts of violence. And you could see the difference between here and here visually, that we went from a fairly light number of reports coming in real time to our system to about 50 relevant reports a second, and are responding to explosions, militarization of particular political actors, and other fairly significant security concerns. Our in-country team then would escalate reports of these nature to a network of coordinating security officials in the capital of Nigeria called Abuja, and then in some instances there would be some sort of security response in order to help to maintain the safety of the electoral process and the security of the people of Nigeria. Now let me pause for a second. That tells you sort of a story that I wanted to highlight a few things. One, we didn't mean to go in and work on digital methods and social movements. We were just working in this other area, but they all, meaning our collaborators in Nigeria, only cared about Facebook and elections. And two, we thought, all right, no system works currently in this regard. It didn't meet the needs. We have 2 weeks, go. And we started to build the system from scratch because, having explored all the available options in 2011, there simply was no available option to do this work. It wasn't like we wanted to be big, wanky computer programmers. It was that we sort of saw the need and we responded. But what is the digital method that emerged through that very bottom-up evolutionary process out of the 2011 election in Nigeria, such that we have today a system that continues to be used in elections across the planet many times a year? And I think there's a number of ways for us to think about what that system is, but I'm going to share with you one particular way, and that it is not a social analytics tool in the sense that some of those images in this morning's presentation would be. It's not just a keyhole or an agro-pulse or one of the many, 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 mostly corporate paid social media analytic tool. And one reason it's not just a social media analytic tool is it extends the kind of digital materials that it aggregates beyond what we would traditionally call social media. I'll show you a bit more what I mean by that in a second. In addition, there's always humans in the loop. It's not a perfection of some sort of analytic system, entirely algorithmic, that then polishes and perfects some particular report and delivers it to the people who then do whatever they were going to do. Instead, it's very much a collaborative interweaving of the activists in using the software and whatever the software is able to manage in real time. And finally, it was purpose designed for the exact kind of context we were working with in 2011, in particular this political event in Nigeria. So what do I mean by this isn't just social media? Instead, what it is a broader transmedia aggregator for digital inputs. And it depends on how you want to define social media, and I'm not going to be kind of engaging in a Socratic program of definition mongering with you because, frankly, I think any definition is fine as long as we agree to it. But what I do want to say is that routinely one would think of as social media as being something that's many to many or some to some. If you're posting in your Facebook kind of network, it's you and your friends and people who've friended you. They might come to learn of your lunch selection today. They might like your lunch selection and in that sense applaud you for your performative activity online. You went for the turkey, not the roast beef. You went for Szechuan and not Cantonese today, whatever it is. Bravo, well done. And that's kind of a sum-to-sum activity. It's not that all of Facebook gets to see your lunch selection, nor is it made in your case for all of Facebook. It's really for your kind of small network of friends, for them to enjoy, for them to pat you on the back, such that in this case, Facebook continues as a corporate interest to benefit from your increasingly private disclosures, which they monetize and sell on in profile to their advertising partners. But if Facebook is some to some or many to many, what is SMS? Now, in many cases, including the Nigerian election, including also the next election that we're deploying a robust Aggie system, which is Ghana in December of this year, SMS short codes are acquired by our civil society activist collaborators and then advertised for the purpose of grassroots, crowd-based reporting of electoral irregularities. So what is SMS? If Facebook is some to some, SMS is what? Should I give a hint? SMS is one-to-one. It's an individualized author sending, in this case, to a short code that goes to an individualized, maybe there's 2 or 3 of us sitting on the other end of that short code, but an individualized reader. It's not for any other broader publication. And in addition to sort of SMS, and I'll come back to RSS, we are increasingly supporting an additional online report system that we called ELMO, and that is another artifactual output from my lab at Georgia Tech, and in this case, the Carter Center, which is an NGO based in Atlanta, Georgia, ran by Jimmy Carter, who many of you perhaps recall to be a former president of the United States, and he's pictured there with his wife, Rosalind Carter, using the ELMO system from a few years back. Now, what the ELMO system does is it allows a prescribed and generally trained set of individual field operators to use tablets or handsets and fill out predefined surveys about something, whatever you create the survey to be about, But in our case, for the ELMO system, specifically designed to be about electoral activities. And what that survey routinely would be, if I'm the Carter Center in particular, would be things like, when did the polling place open? How big is the queue? Are there officers from the National Electoral Commission? Are there observers from the major political parties, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? You get the sense, right? So this is a particular software system that's designed specifically for electoral context. So you could imagine it being repurposed for other sort of things like natural disasters or other things that have some of the similar feel, a bit of a real-time response, et cetera, et cetera. And the back end, the sort of server-based side, not the client side, which is just the survey materials that might populate your handset or your tablet, but the server-based side then would allow for real-time analysis. Because you actually know ahead of time what your questions are, it could even do things like the average time that a polling unit is being reported by our 1,000 field representatives using the system is 8:10 a.m. in the morning, something like that. Okay, so coming back to sort of what this means as it relates to transmedia. Again, we talked about Facebook as sort of some to some, or if you wish, many to many. And I said that SMS is one-to-one. It's essentially a single author communicating a single bit of text to a single recipient. But there also are one-to-many and many-to-one. What is ELMO? I keep doing the same pop quiz, so it should start getting, some responses now. If SMS is one-to-one, which is ELMO? I have 100, I have 1,000 trained operators, many to one, exactly. So maybe I have 1,000 or 100 of these operators doing these surveys, but they're all being channeled back to essentially what we could think of as one individual. It is that person manning the server-side dashboard that's providing the real-time analytics for response. And then what about one-to-many? Is there anything that I mentioned as a media source type for Aggie that might be one-to-many? What? The RSS, if it's coming from things like the South China Post or whatever. Why is that one-to-many? Well, that means it's a media journalist, authoring as an individual, but broadcasting to a large readership. So it's any news, for instance, source or popular blogger or something like that. Now, it turns out from a digital methods standpoint that what we had wandered into naively, premised initially on one of the most moronic emails I perhaps have sent out in my professional career, the one with the voila sentence, was a system that expanded the digital analytics problem into a space that actually is a lot harder than if we were just doing Facebook and Twitter. Because the way in which you could relate and usefully triangulate between these various social media types, and I'm using broad categories when I talk about one-to-one versus many-to-many versus one-to-many. I mean, these are archetypically different in aspects of their very core nature. Modulo PS, a little parenthesis, of course Facebook supports almost all these modes these days because it's a all things to all people platform, and you can do real-time Facebook Messenger and all that stuff. So not to, I just want to make clear that of course that's true, that many of these platforms now bring in many different types of interaction modalities. But what we stumbled into here by bringing together this wide range of media types is that it's really tricky, it's really interesting, and it's potentially very powerful to design systems that make use of the fact that there is a heterogeneity and diversity of source media types. Is one mode inherently more reliable? Is many-to-many or many-to-one more reliable? Put more easily, Is Elmo more reliable than Facebook? After all, anybody could blabber away on Facebook. Anyone could tweet and pick a particular hashtag or whatever. But Elmo, these are in theory known, trained field observers. Is it more reliable? I mean, that's just an empirically findable result. I don't know if it's generalizable, but it's empirically studyable. I don't have an answer. I suspect the answer is not the trivial answer, like, yes, if we know them, their information is more reliable. My guess is that's not the answer. Is one source type inherently more reliable? So a source type would be something like Facebook versus Twitter. Is Facebook information more reliable than tweets? Is there something inherent about that, or is it just happens to be some empirical thing that has some chance or some cultural context? More reliable people want to use Twitter than want to use Facebook? What is it? How do you handle the intense variability in the volumes between these sources? This is a huge, just practical, at the very lowest, engineering and design challenge we have. Elmo reports might come on the order of 1 every 30 minutes. Tweets are coming on the order of 100 a second. How do you manage the signal-to-noise ratio, the needle in a haystack problem? These are not new problems. That's a traditional problem in many digital methods. You have way too much data and you really want to find the 5 things that matter. But this is a different problem insofar as maybe none of it matters, but it's coming to you at orders of magnitude different volumes. You know, one maybe is 10 or 100,000 times more stuff coming. And you still only have 5 things you want to find out between orders of magnitude of different volumes. I think this, for me, is a holy grail question for us, at least in my team. What are the powers of intersource or source type triangulation? Is there something special that would allow you to say, I hear it on Twitter and I verify it on Elmo? And, you know, there are design issues, there's engineering issues, there's social scientific issues as to how to actually best manage these kinds of systems. And we've made some progress, but I don't have answers to any of these questions, that's to be sure. And finally, you know, on and on and on. What are sort of other digital method questions that have come out of this 5-year project that we have undertaken? Well, I said there's humans in the loop and that analytics only gets you so far, but we know, and again, going back to that huge graph of 1 million different systems, there's plenty of machine learning and clustering approaches, there's plenty of visualization, natural language, and text analytic approaches, and 99% of them don't work. I don't know, what would you all say? 90% don't work, most of them do not work. When we apply basic machine learning, when we apply basic clustering, including the blockbuster, well understood clustering techniques, they do not provide any useful real-time analytics to our teams working with us in the field. Nothing. I would say the one thing that says is don't be duped by some of these these companies or startups or whatever they are who want you to think that they've solved these problems. The next newest AI that's going to do everything you need in online data analysis and natural language understanding is probably just like the last big AI that did the same, and that all of us have forgotten because, frankly, it met none of our needs. Okay, so let me kind of switch bases a little. I'm going to go from that story of 2011 to today, accidentally designing a system we never meant to, and then stumbling into a bunch of questions that we can't solve. And instead talk about something that in certain ways is frankly a little easier, and it's that given that this Aggie platform sits there and vacuums up thousands or millions of reports across some particular incident, in our case, elections, that does give us, as digital explorers, capacity to not just support real-time response, but also to support post hoc analysis. And so we have, and in particular, this particular study is work with Amanda Meng, a colleague of mine. We've done comparative analysis of 3 elections where we did the same basic thing. We gobbled up huge amounts of Twitter and Facebook and RSS stuff, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, from 2011, 2012, and 2013 in Nigeria, Ghana, and Kenya, and then did some post hoc analysis where we were trying to answer the question, does this corpus of online discourse provide some representation of the particular political maturation or democratic deepening within the country that we are comparing? And so all of this is premised foundationally upon some understanding of democratic theory, and in our case, in particular, things like deliberative democracy, and the role that scholars have underlined for legitimate and effective citizen engagement in debate and reflection of policies within a country. And on the counter, the role of identity as, in many cases, a process under which individuals within some particular political process rely upon constructed identity, in particular religion, ethno-linguistic groups, tribal affiliations, or gender, in order generally for a particular political stakeholder to weaken the actual policy-relevant democratic deliberation, and instead, through a particular identity, attempt to suppress another identity, such that the political elites ultimately bring citizens into the political process not through deliberative democratic action, but instead through clientelism premised upon identity. In other words, the voters receive favors and not voice. And so if we agree to this kind of description of potentially different democratic theories and processes, then it's certainly a matter of social science, and in our case, a little bit of computer science inquiry, to actually attempt to compare the discourses across these 3 countries, and then to see if we could find some sort of attunement between the level of democratic deepening that scholars have identified for the country and the level of policy-relevant or identity political conversation within the, in this case, Twitter social media discourse. And so we're looking at these 3 different countries, and for the purpose of time, I'm going to just go very, very quick and summarize them by saying Nigeria, not so much. It's basically viewed as an autocracy. It's had a number of recent failed elections, and then the last 2 elections, I think, are considered by and large okay. Ghana is sort of the other end of the West African political spectrum. It's definitely viewed as a polyarchy. It's had 5, I think, democratic transitions in the last 2 to 3 decades, often held up as the strongest political system in that part of the world. And then Kenya may be sitting somewhere in between the 2 Ghana and Nigeria examples, where in particular identity politics framed an era of leadership under Daniel Moi, and then a failed election in 2011 and 4 years before that, where identity was used as the main electoral decision matrix. Are you Kikuyu or are you Luo? So we gathered together all this data. You could see it's about 750,000 tweets. We're just looking at tweets in this case, and there's a bunch of sort of narrowing of our data set. Again, moving fast so that I can get through this material and have time for Q&A. We then applied Luminoso, which is a text analysis tool, came out of MIT. It essentially does visualization and two important digital methods to text and natural language corpora. And those two important methods are the application of a concept network. And a concept network or semantic network is basically a bag of words, terms, that are connected based upon semantic or meaning relevance. So the word school and the word university within the semantic network for English would be highly associated, very close to each other, because university is essentially a type of school. School is sort of a superset of universities. Semantically, they have considerable meaning. And by applying a concept net to this corpus, you could actually leverage those kind of conceptual relatedness by doing a query about schools, but actually getting responses that only use the word university. The second major digital method employed by this system is a method designed probably 200 years ago by linear algebraists, singular value decomposition or eigenvalue decomposition or principal component analysis, a system that essentially takes very high dimension spaces and by the application of mathematics that is more complicated than I can really understand, squishes it into smaller dimension spaces. And those smaller dimensions, if you actually go to the eigenvalue, eigen meaning representation in German, I think, you can read off semantically meaningful clusters of words. So these two approaches, I'm calling them digital methods because they're only useful now that we actually have digital systems. You could never do this by hand back in the day. You know, I'm going to go into my kitchen and do a principal component analysis of a high and sparse matrix. It just never would happen. But we can do it today. These two systems, along with Luminoso's text visualization, allowed us to do our analysis. We then created two term or query sets, one that was policy relevant, and the policy relevance was determined by analyzing the political party manifestos, essentially the platforms, what we would call platforms in the States, at least, of the political parties for things that were policy relevant. And the identity terms came through our own kind of creation of identity terminology that was relevant to location, ethno-linguistic or tribal group, and religion primarily. And we did all this stuff. I'm going to kind of gloss the technical details because there's a lot of hand coding and correction and all the normal. Anyone who does text analysis, you kind of can feel the pain because there's all these systems never quite work. Here's some of the takeaways. So this is the percentage of data within that initial data set that we coded as identity, and this is policy. Nigeria and Kenya, about 2% of the reports over Twitter from our relevant data set. So these were all conversations about politics in those countries, but only 2% of the conversation of politics in these two countries were coded as policy relevant. Whereas in Ghana, 13%, so almost, let's say, a times 6 percentage of the conversations about the elections and political activities had a policy relevance to it. Whereas when we look at identity, twice the amount of policy relevant conversations in Nigeria were identity relevant, focused on religion or tribe primarily. And so maybe surprisingly, the lowest amount of identity conversations were in Kenya, but the historical fact was that this was the 2013 election in Kenya, and they had just 4 years ago had a horribly painful election, entirely identity-based, the Kikuyu versus Luo kind of identity politics, and so they were really careful. They knew that they couldn't quite spend too much time openly discussing identity politics. So just to give you a sense of kind of some of the stuff we're talking about, and I'll conclude, here are some of these kind of tweets. So here's a tweet about democracy in Nigeria that we coded as actually having relevance to democracy. What every Nigerian wants is peace and security, true democracy and prosperity. We must not vote for the people who betrayed us twice. Whereas here's what we would call an identity-based, or we coded rather as an identity-based tweet in Nigeria. Maybe what Nigeria needs is a president who's a half Igbo, half Hausa Muslim, born and raised in the Niger Delta with a Yoruba wife. That person would then cover every last possible major tribal and ethno-linguistic group in the country, and therefore, nobody would be unhappy with them, because if they weren't speaking your language, their wife was. That's kind of the point there. And then in Kenya, here's some examples of kind of a policy-relevant tweet. 5 years on, how will we measure government effectiveness, improved economic integration with our neighbors? Identity-oriented tweet in Kenya. I'll never ever trust Kikuyu, F-U, Kikuyus, F-U. So most scholars are in agreement, I think, that social media has yet to cause power shifts in politics. And while it's enabling elements of political and social movements and political and social democracy, it's not always a tool for positive components. It's Janus-faced. There are multiple valences. And it's just as you might use these technologies to support policy-relevant, democratic deepening, deliberative action, you can similarly use it to call out your neighbors and co-countrymen for their identity, their gender, or their religion. We found, however, that the Twitter discourse in this particular study lined up with the social scientific analysis of the level of democratic deepening and the expected amount of policy-relevant discourse. So that countries that had a more robust democracy had 6 times more online discussions that were policy relevant. Let me end them with my thanks for your attention and a 5-second advertisement. The United Nations University in Macau, just across the water, is not a university. It is one of 13 autonomous research institutes within the U.S. system, each of which has its own purpose and research objectives. The Institute in Macau, which is only 18 months old, focuses on computer and society, and by that we're particularly currently focused on ICTs and women's empowerment and gender issues, computing and peace, security and peace building, and data from the crowd and for the crowd. We invite you to Macau, and we're going to have more and more parties and more activities. But I really want to end with this slide to let you know we need your help. As the newest research institute within the United Nations system, with just the, as I say, 18 months of operation, we are hiring, we're building partnerships, and we'd love to have all of you involved and very much continue our relationship with Jack and the rest of our friends here at Chinese University. So with that, thank you very much for your attention.
So thank you, Michael, for this very insightful speech. So now we're going to open the floor for Q&A. So I have one very fast hand raised. So you sir?
Hello, thank you, Michael. That's a nice presentation. I'm Pasha. I'm from the University of Queensland. Actually, I'm very new in these topics, digital methods. I don't have that much of knowledge in this. But I'm just wondering that in terms of reliability, that you were saying that AGI, we will try to predict the incidents. So how much is the AGI is reliable? And sometimes the Facebook or the Twitter, the status or the post, it must be influenced by some other posts. Like if, okay, my friend gives this post and I'm giving that post again. So this sort of variability and these sort of things, how do you analyze this? Just explanation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So in terms of reliability, another kind of empirical question that we could answer through sort of field research, the best numbers we have came out of a Ghanaian election 4 years ago, where we very closely tried to analyze our reliability. And by reliability, we're asking, what percentage of incidents, which is that very, we use that in a special way in Aggie. It means things that we've escalated, a collection of reports we've escalated for action. What percentage of those are, let's say, reliable? And the simple answer is 50%. 50% of incidences that were escalated in that particular 3 days of the Ghanaian election cycle were true novel, and actionable. And half of them were either untrue or unactionable. Now, when I got that result from my research partners, essentially my students, they were super bummed. They're like, Mike, we have some really bad news. Only half of our incidents are essentially true. And my response was, are you kidding me? That's great. Half is great. For the kind of thing we're doing, half is actually quite okay. Now, if we could push it up, especially due to better software analytics, we would. But half meant that every time we sent a report to the National Election Commission in Ghana, every 2 times, one of the times, they were like, holy whatever, we had, holy crap, we had no idea this was going on. We sent people, we responded, everything's all right. And they were happy with that. They were like, 50% is really fine. It's more reliable than almost any other information they were getting because they're used to getting information that was quite unreliable. So that's the answer to your first thing. In terms of how all these things talk to each other, that's a very, I think, more tricky question. I don't have any specific study where I could say, well, we actually have looked at the way people are talking on Twitter, especially transmedia-wise, and is it bleeding over to Facebook, let alone how people are talking on different groups on Facebook. But it's certainly something that folks who study social media are asking those kind of questions, but I have nothing special I could add or subtract. Yeah.
Okay, another question? Yes, Richard.
Just borrow it for 1 second. So thanks very much. I think it's really, really impressive what you've done with that system. And I have a follow-up question. It's quite similar. So when you, both in the corporate realm and in the NGO realm and in the academic realm, when one builds one of these systems, or whether it's a dashboard or something similar, oftentimes most of the discussion about it is the inputs and the outputs and not the use. And I'm quite curious whether about the users of the system, and maybe you could just talk generally about it. But there's a couple of things that I wanted to mention. So the first one is, when one is coding, there's like inter-coder reliability and things like this. So I'm wondering if there's like inter-user, so are users seeing the same things as other users, whether that's been thought of, or so can you tell us a little bit about the use of the system?
Yeah, there used to be this thing, and I think it came from the right place, especially in ICTD, my area, computing and international development, which was users were never, were just not part of the entire calculation. They were maybe at best an afterthought. And maybe were even asked after the fact whether they liked the system, but it really didn't matter. Now we're in the exact opposite side of things, where everything is participatory, all users, nothing is ever done without a full stakeholder consultation in a participatory, collaborative way to ensure that users actually, are articulating and we are listening effectively and then responding. The problem is, in the first case, that users are the users and obviously are enormously critical stakeholders into any sort of design process. The problem in the second case is it turns out they rarely know what they actually do want and have really struggled to be able to articulate features, for instance, that they would use given some particular use case. So you're sort of damned if you do or damned if you don't in certain regards, because you're getting noisy information in both cases. Or maybe in one case it's super noisy, and the other case it's not there. In the case of the users for Aggie, the initial system was entirely user-driven. So the story I tried to tell was us showing up to do something entirely unrelated, and then being spurred on by essentially the users, our collaborators in Nigeria, to do this other thing, entirely different. And they had the initial vision, for sure, entirely user-based. This was a long 5-year collaboration, very complicated. We actually, a colleague of mine did a study just on the relationship between these organizations, because as an international development specialist, a lot of what we think about is how do we collaborate across political boundaries, across demographics, across economic levels of development, et cetera. And I would say within a year or two, our users actually lost their way and could no longer articulate useful input to us that would have helped guide our system. And all, that is a argument that I will make till I'm blue in the face. We would have to have that offline for sure, but I could tell you why I just think they were the users, but they had no idea what they were wanting, and they were wrong. So it's a case where, the user is not always right, but the user is also the most important part of the whole system. So it's tricky, I guess, is the best I could say.
Okay, I think we have time for one more. Yes? Okay, Melissa? Okay. Well, Joseph demands that you ask the question. Okay.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a question about the theories of democracy that you had up, and the political philosophies that you were drawing on as the framework, and whether the methods are actually going to help you long-term to speak back to some of those founding theories of democracy. It seems like one of the most optimistic aspects of this to me.
Yeah, I'm not qualified to do that work, but I know people who are, and I would love to engage with people who I think could collaborate with us on this long-term kind of feedback process. What I think is clear already, for sure, even that modest study makes very clear that if you're a political party, you need to look at this. If you're other political or policy stakeholders, you need to look at this. If you want to create a client-based political base, you need to look at this. So there's kind of already an obvious, I want to get my work done, I want to get elected, I need all this. And we've seen this even more so in certain ways in different countries across the globe, in ways that they've really made use of some of these digital tools in ways that they value. In terms of let's say we are supporters of deliberative democracy or strong democracy, no. If I only get one choice, I would probably go with some of these approaches. I do think that we could, over time, develop arguments as to how these systems may or may not impact a strong democracy or make a strong democracy weaker or vice versa. It will not, however, happen, and no matter what your political theory you want, it will not happen in the absence of purposeful design. And this is the thing that I worry the most about. We imagine that Facebook is just it's a tabula rasa. It's this perfect system for people to communicate whatever they want. Let's say it's political discourse here, it's my lunch choices there. It has no dog in the game, right? It is neutral. Well, it's not. It in its case, not because of any insidious purpose, but due to their business model, is an architecture for disclosures, like we already discussed. It's an architecture designed to get you to reveal personal information and to increasingly reveal that personal information such that Facebook can monetize those revelations and sell them on to, in the case of your lunch decision, maybe a cold cut provider or a cheese seller or whatever it is, you know, a sandwich purveyor of sandwiches. In the absence of a digital infrastructure designed for, let's say, strong democracy, if that's what we want, I don't think we're just going to get it. And that's the thing that I mostly worry about. It's the lack of attention to design. And it's more just like, well, this is what the big boys, frankly, in the Pacific Northwest are giving us, so we just get it. And now let's see what we can do with it. That's where I feel like the whole system might come falling apart. But we'll see. We're all designers, so we can contribute.